From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you all here this evening. My name is David Plyler, and I'm a music specialist at the Library of Congress. And it's my great pleasure to be here with Andreas Steyer, who I'm sure you all know and you can read about in your programs once you get those. We only have a limited amount of time with him, so I'm not going to spend too much time with accolades, except that he's just a wonderful artist on many different keyboards. So tonight we'll be hearing him on the harpsichord. And it's a great pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, indeed.
I thought we would just start with talking about this very unique program that you've put together for us tonight, and just maybe what are some of the inspirations behind it and motivations for putting together this program?
Well, it actually happened from different angles. In a certain way, I could quote Franz Schubert, who once said, "Is there joyful music? Not that I would know of any." And this is debatable, maybe. If you listen to Rossini operas, there might well be, but some of the most wonderful pieces, not only in the keyboard repertoire, but also in the keyboard repertoire, happen to be melancholic pieces. And one initial idea was very pragmatic. I had a few long-term favorite pieces of the 17th century, which I somehow wanted to bind together in a program. And then at some point, the concept of melancholy in music seemed appealing. I mean, to tell you the truth, those two very favorite pieces of mine are at the end of each half of the concert. It is the Tombeau for Blanc Rocher by Louis Couperin, and it is a very different piece at the end of the second half, the very grand and virtuose Passacaglia of Georg Muffat. So in very different ways, they reflect melancholic ideas.
I think that that's one of the key things that I get from listening to this program is that precisely what you just said, which is that it's in very different ways of approaching this idea. Each one of these pieces is quite unique and expresses a very interesting and unique perspective, I think, on these composers. And I don't know if you can say a few things about the different composers and what, speaking to that a bit.
Yes, maybe I can start with the French composers. It is a program somehow divided equally between French and German composers of the 17th century. Maybe just one sentence before, the German composers in that century and also in the first half of the 18th century very often tried to learn from the two great musical nations, Italy and France. So in this case, it's more about France and the French influence. And yet, I can say something later to it, yet, of course, they didn't become French composers by learning from the French. So to start with the French group of composers, maybe the two most, in our context, the two most typical genres of pieces are, on one hand, the tombeaux, so the tombstones on famous persons who had died in many cases, musicians writing epitaphs on other musicians, on their teachers, like the tombeau for Chambonnière by Danglebert, which I will play. Chambonnière was the teacher of Danglebert. And there is an interesting ambiguity. Of course, writing a piece in memory of someone means being sad that he is no longer there, but also somehow by composing a piece of music which hopefully will be very good music, you make him last. So it is seen from two corners. And what, how could I say, there is a very particular approach of middle 17th century France towards that genre of music. Very often you have pieces which in the middle of a phrase suddenly they seem to hesitate, and there is like a moment of silence which gives composer and listener the chance to think about sounds dying away. It's also very typical that most of tombeaus, or probably even all of them, are written for instrument, for the instruments lute and harpsichord, which have decaying sounds. You plug a string, and after a certain while, the sound is no longer there. So even a single note, in a way, is symbolic of the decaying of that, reminding us that nothing will ever last. And as if the music is composed around this quality of notes going away.
You know, it's at the same time that it accomplishes that, I think, exactly as you just expressed it, I think it also gives it some space to live. What I find with these, with your recording of these pieces, is that there's a great deal of freedom that comes in those spaces that allows for a breadth that you don't necessarily always expect to be there, and so in that sense, it's a very interesting way to approach the music, I think.
It is also music which is quite close to improvisation. So in the sense you just said, it is music which has a certain rhythmical freedom. It is not rhythmically solid like later Baroque music, where always somehow there is a continuous forward-going movement. And the other genre, maybe that can highlight that, is the so-called prélude non mesuré, the non-measured prelude, where composers give the pitches of notes, but not a rhythmical notation. So you are supposed to find the rhythmical narrative yourself, obviously deriving it from the harmonies and from certain proportions, but it's the rhythmical aspect is given completely freely to the performer. You have sometimes only full notes and nothing else on the paper, and occasionally some slurs to tell you this belongs together until here. Also, that is music which plays with freedom and spontaneity and the ambivalence of going forward and standing still again. So those two composition techniques are maybe at the very center of French music around 1650, you would say.
When you encounter these types of situations where there is, say, an unmeasured prelude or extended cadenza-like passages, do you find that, but especially in the cases of the unmeasured preludes, do you find that you tend to lock in on a particular type of interpretation, or is it always something that's a variable thing for you, or is there something that just kind of jumps out in particular ways, or is it really just depend on the situation?
Well, certain things don't really depend on the situations because certain cadences are just there, like a grammatical caesura. But it's interesting, one plays these preludes and in the middle of something, one is maybe a little bit faster or a little bit slower, and that has consequences. And then you are somehow like driving a car. If you drive very fast into a curve, it will feel very different from driving slowly into the curve and maybe then speeding up. So you have sometimes these feelings that whatever, of course you cannot and you should not reproduce exactly one interpretation. It will always change, even though you have your basic outlook doesn't really change, but you are a bit different in the beginning without even noticing or without being intentionally different. And then you have to take some consequences out of that, and these consequences lead to other consequences. And then in the middle of the piece, you realize, actually, I'm doing it quite differently, but I didn't really have a choice because the first step somehow determines something in a mysterious way.
Is there a different approach that is taken with, say, if we're limiting for the sake of discussion that type of notation to the French as a sort of a French way? Is there a German way of providing a similar type of improvisatory feel, particularly in the program that you're presenting?
Yes, absolutely. It is always the question, I mean, one thinks it's easy to notate music, and the more one knows about music, the more one sees how sketchy even precise notation is, and that sometimes it's hardly possible to notate everything in a precise way. I mean, yesterday we looked at some Schubert scores, and in some of his scores you feel that he wasn't sure if he should write an accent or a sforzato or a decrescendo, and each has its certain truth, but maybe what he had in mind was a bit of everything, and you can't, that a bit of everything you cannot write. In writing down, you have to decide, I write like this or I write like this, but maybe you're not completely satisfied with either. And Froberger, for instance, is the very first piece I'm going to play is a lamento, so also a kind of tombeau. Although no one died, he took the boat from France to England, and when he woke up in the night, everything had been stolen, his wallet, passport, and credit card. So he is melancholic to have lost all his belongings, which is a bad thing, especially in an expensive city like London. Makes you, so he writes a piece which is not at all very different in its basic characteristic, but he writes it in bars. But then he writes, please play it with all liberty. So this is the other approach, which might end up in a very similar playing, and sometimes it is helpful to have bar lines and spelled out rhythms, but it might also be misleading because rhythms are not just an eighth note makes 2 16th notes and 4 32nd notes. Maybe he wanted something in between, and for the in between, of course, the more vague notation of the French is more suited. So it's interesting that we have this genre of pieces in two different notational forms, and the Germans and Italians did it that way, and the French did it the other way.
You know, another interesting thing along those lines is the purely visual aspect of this, where the spatialization of the notes on the page also indicates something in terms of how one might play them, especially with the spacing with the with no bar lines, but also you get a little bit of that when you have, like say, highly ornate passages that are still in a metered situation.
Yes,
but there's something maybe psychological about it, or that still provides this.
Absolutely, yes,
yeah.
of course. There's always the aspect of notation also giving you a certain overall impression as a graphic work of art, you could say. And so you briefly look at a page, and without noticing, having the time to notice any details, it already says something to you.
Maybe we can take a few moments to talk about another aspect of your playing that I really admire, or actually more in terms of your programming, is that you tend to have these very distinctive ideas behind an album that you release. We mentioned this the other day about the Diabelli variations, where you have a recording where you include the Beethoven set alongside a handful or maybe a dozen or so of the other types that were other variations that were written by other composers at the time. How do you have a general approach and how you put these albums together and these programs together for your live performances? Is it something where, like in this case, you kind of have pieces that you particularly want to present, and then you glom onto those and have it expand? Or do you have what is your approach to that, I would say?
It's really impossible to say. It in a way assembles itself. I mean, as I said, in the case of the program of today, I had some pieces I had been playing, and I tried to find a nice context and remain in the 17th century. So for once, not including Bach and Scarlatti and the famous 18th century composers. In the case of what you just said, the Diabelli variations, it also was at the beginning, it was just the very pragmatic fact that the Diabelli variations are too short for one concert length. The Goldberg variations are just fine, non-stop, 78 minutes, or it depends a bit who plays, and if you do all the repeats. So that is fine for a concert with or without intermission. The Diabelli variations take about 50 minutes, so that is slightly too short for a concert, except it's a matinee concert. So what to do with the remaining half hour? And then I looked, I mean, in that case, the most obvious, and where I looked first, is the collection of variations over the same waltz by 50 other composers, which it was a big publicity thing. Diabelli started, he was a composer, and actually not such a bad composer, and he composed this waltz and handed it out to everybody he knew, and to all the passing virtuosos in Vienna. And when he had sent it to everybody, including Beethoven, Beethoven was extremely irritated because he was not everybody. He was not just a composer like everybody else, and he wanted the waltz somehow engraved in gold. If at all, So at first he dismissed it, and then something fascinated him. He started composing. He didn't finish. He composed about 2/3, and then put it away for the work on his last 3 piano sonatas, Missa Solemnis and Ninth Symphony. Came back to it. In the meantime, all the other composers, everybody had been asked, I forgot to mention, to compose one variation. So Beethoven, for him, the choice was not to compose one variation like the others. It was to compose either 0, because he was too good for it, or to kill everybody else. So everybody else, including Schubert, wrote one variation, and Diabelli had the tact and delicatesse to wait with the publication of all the other variations until Beethoven had finally finished his, and then some months later, the other 50 composers had their turn, among also 13-year-old Franz Liszt. It's one of his earliest pieces. And then I started looking in these 50 variations, and it's a wonderful mixture. Some are really bad music. Probably Diabelli asked his tax accountant and dentist as well. But he also asked a few very good composers, and even a few not well-known composers did very, very nice things. And what is interesting, some of them had exactly the same ideas Beethoven applied in some of his variations. So it's also, it makes you think about genius and not so genius in the best moment of a non-genius. Maybe he's not even so far away from a mediocre moment of a genius. So, yeah.
And especially if you only have to do one instead of 33, then you're saying,
of course. That's also a very different thing. Even Beethoven would have done something different if someone had forced him to write only one.
Well, one thing I wanted to do before, I'd like to see if there are any audience questions before we release Mr. Steyer back to be able to prepare for the concert. We have one over here. We have a microphone that's coming around.
Thank you. Should German harpsichord music be played on German harpsichords and French music played on French harpsichords, or does it not matter?
Interesting question. Should, in a way, yes, and in another way, maybe not necessarily. What we underestimate in our times of emails and text messages is that the international contacts between musicians who lived far apart from each other was actually very much more intensive than we would think it would have been possible. So there were foreign instruments in all the countries, and it is completely defendable to play, surely to play German music on a French harp. It depends a bit on which French harpsichord exactly. But so this is on one level a response. Another response would be in a program where I want to show somehow the proximity. I would maybe not use two instruments in order to separate, but to concentrate on one sound in order to make listeners compare within one sound. A third problem is the purely pragmatic, that having two instruments on the stage makes the concert more expensive. And then it depends. There are places where this would be possible and other places where it wouldn't even be thinkable. So I have played this program as much on German instruments as on French instruments or on Flemish French instruments. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm a real enthusiast of the harpsichord. I have actually built one, French double. And my questions are two. First, how did you get interested and involved? Did you start out on the piano, or were you always interested in the harpsichord? And number two, have you seen any kind of waxes and wanes of interest? Is there a resurgence in harpsichord music, or what have you noticed over your career? Thank you.
So the first question, I started playing the modern piano, and I played, when I was a child, I played sometimes together with a girl who was 5 years older, and her parents had a little harpsichord at home, a very bad one, but I found it somehow, there was something in it, although I wasn't even sure I loved the sound. but there was something in it which interested me, and then I started looking at music in the music store, and like for instance, at a certain point, maybe when I was 10 or so, I bought the Fitzwilliam Virginal book, because it was such a cheap edition. I thought this is great. It was 2 volumes thick like this, both together, and it was really cheap. And I played it all from beginning to end. I had no idea about the background of this music, and I tried it out on that harpsichord, and so that's why I got interested. And much, much later, I got into contact with real historical copies of harpsichords which have a much more interesting and rich sound, like the one we are having here this evening. And then I had a very, very inspiring teacher at the conservatory. So it happened a bit like this. And your second question, is there in my opinion, this is maybe one more reason for the program Melancholie. In my opinion, the interest is dying out or is decreasing, which I find a great pity because there is so much harpsichord music I love. But I see that somehow there was a certain wave of interest created by the post-war generation of musicians like Leonard and Harnoncourt, who just died a few days ago, and then there was somehow, how could I say, without sounding too melancholic, there was a double process. The modern ensembles tried to learn, which was of course a very good thing. But of course, even if you try to imitate a little bit what is known in the sources about so-called authentic performance practice, which never can be authentic anyway, on modern instrument, it doesn't. There are limits. It doesn't really work. So what you frequently end up with is a strange halfway. It's not really romantic, but it's not really this and not really that. And on the other hand, also, I think I can say more out of a European perspective. Obviously, there is less money for culture now than there was 20 years ago. And that makes concert promoters dare less. And that has a consequence that you play, you are, as a harpsichord player, in 90% of the cases, promoters ask me, could you please play the Goldberg Variations? I could spend the rest of my aging career on harpsichord playing the Goldberg Variations, and I think the Goldberg Variations are one of the most wonderful things in all music. But there is so much music which, in my opinion, deserves to be played, like a program today, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to play this program. So, yeah, is it
Well, maybe as before we get to that last question, let's take one more question.
For which major composers would you say there's the biggest distance between how it sounds on the harpsichord and how it sounds or works on the piano? I've heard Couperin doesn't work on the piano and is so idiomatic to the harpsichord. What would you say is the biggest distance, and maybe perhaps some smaller distances between how well they work on the various instruments?
I think indeed what you said already, the French music is particularly close, intimate to the sound, to a certain world of sound. On the other hand, Bach has a solidity because of his polyphonic approach that makes his pieces also better transcribable. One of the nicest performances I ever heard of the Art of Fugue has been by a saxophone quartet. And really, there is no joke. They did a wonderful job. You could not, even that wonderful ensemble, they could not have played François Couperin equally successfully on with their 4 saxophones. So different musical styles and different composers have a different relationship towards their sound. And it's also not thinkable to play a Chopin nocturne or it wouldn't be very agreeable to listen to a Chopin nocturne in an orchestral instrumentation. So, which doesn't mean that there is less profundity in those composers who let their music be more intimately influenced by the sound medium. It's just a different approach, and we have this different approach throughout the musical history. And for some strange reasons, often the German composers cared a bit less about sound than structure and have a certain solidity which is as much a quality as it might be also a bit unelegant, or, well, we Germans are pedants, so maybe it has to do with that.
Well, we really don't have much more time, but I was wondering if, as a last word, maybe you could just say a few things about what you're up to these days, or what your next projects might be coming up, recording or performing.
Well, there are a number of half-ready ideas, and it's sometimes not wise to speak about half-finished ideas. But one idea was actually to make a happy sister or brother to this program, to try to do something with only happy music, and yeah. For the rest, I'm on and off. Something which has been accompanying me for a very long time is the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, and there might eventually be a recording. One of the reasons I didn't want to record it, apart from not feeling ready, is again a very pragmatic. Once you record a piece, the record company asks you, "Oh, could you please play it as often as possible in concert?" And as opposed to the Goldberg variations, which are a cycle, the Well-Tempered Clavier is not a cycle. And in my personal opinion, it is nonsense to play 24 preludes and fugues. It's a torture for the listener, and after the 5th fugue, you cannot appreciate the esprit and the raffinesse so I have offered a few programs combining certain preludes and fugues of Wohltemperiertes Klavier with certain other pieces of different times. I mean, there is so many associations you can have towards the past and towards the future that it's a never-ending story.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your performance in just a few minutes. So join me in thanking.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.